It was a quiet, calm evening in a small suburban neighborhood. The kind of night where everything seemed peaceful. The streetlights flickered gently in the evening mist, and the occasional sound of laughter floated through open windows. Families were winding down for the night, unaware that a dark presence had arrived. Amidst this serene scene, a figure moved through the shadows. Matthew Hale, a man once known as a decorated military veteran, had become something far more dangerous after the horrors he had witnessed overseas. He was now a man broken, hollow, and filled with uncontrollable rage. What people didn't know was that Matthew had been released from a psychiatric facility just days before, his mental state labeled as improved, but the truth was far darker. That night, as the neighborhood slept, Matthew's madness boiled over. Armed with a collection of weapons he'd meticulously prepared, Matthew moved like a ghost, slipping into homes through unlocked doors and open windows. The first house belonged to a family of 4. As the mother turned to check on her children, she felt an unfamiliar presence behind her. Before she could react, a blade slid silently across her throat, and she crumpled to the floor in a pool of blood, her life snuffed out in an instant. Matthew continued his rampage, his footsteps eerily silent. He moved from house to house, systematically executing anyone in his path. Each scene was more horrific than the last. Bodies left twisted and broken, the faces of those who once lived peaceful lives now frozen in terror. The streets, once filled with the warmth of family life, were now silent. A horror unlike any the town had ever seen was unfolding in the dead of night, and no one knew. As he moved through the neighborhood, leaving a trail of death behind, Matthew's mind was plagued by hallucinations. Voices from his past screamed at him, calling him to finish the mission. In his madness, he believed he was still fighting an enemy, that he was carrying out orders. His victims were nameless, faceless threats to him, and he was eliminating them with military precision. But amidst the carnage, a single house stood untouched. Inside, Sophie, a 10-year-old girl, woke up to the strange quiet. She sensed something was wrong, an unsettling heaviness in the air. Quietly, she slipped out of her bed and peeked through her bedroom window. What she saw chilled her to her core. The figure of Matthew, drenched in blood, standing motionless in the middle of the street. He looked like a man possessed, staring blankly into the distance as if waiting for something. With trembling hands, Sophie picked up her phone and dialed 911. Her whisper was barely audible, but it was enough to trigger a response. As the operator tried to calm her, Sophie watched Matthew start moving again, his head tilting as if listening to the voices in his mind. She didn't have long. Minutes later, the silence was shattered by the wail of sirens. Matthew didn't flinch. As police cars roared into the street, he stood perfectly still, a faint smile forming on his lips. It was as though he'd been waiting for them. When the police emerged from their vehicles, weapons drawn, Matthew raised his hands in surrender. But in one final, terrifying act, he reached into his coat, slowly, deliberately. The officers screamed at him to stop, but he didn't. Before anyone could react, he pulled out a small detonator, a twisted smirk playing on his lips. An explosion ripped through the night, engulfing the house he stood in front of in a fiery blaze. It was the home of Sophie and her family, the last family standing. In the aftermath, as firefighters worked to control the blaze and detectives arrived to assess the damage, the town was left shattered. Matthew's rampage had lasted only a few hours, but the devastation was total. Nearly every home had been touched by his madness, and the survivors were left to piece together the horror of what had unfolded while they slept. The neighborhood would never be the same again. And in the silence that followed, people would forever speak in hushed tones about the night of the fallen. The night a man with a fractured mind turned a peaceful community into a place of unimaginable terror.